Hey everyone, welcome back to the PGA Players Podcast. This is your host, Aaron Goldberg, certified financial planner and private wealth advisor at WMO Capital. This week, we're going to talk about probably the biggest threat to your net worth, and that's a lawsuit or some sort of liability that comes up out of nowhere that we want to make sure that we're taking account for and protecting our net worth against. This week is the Waste Management Open. It's a fun week. Lots of parties going on. This year is probably going to be a little bit different with only 8,000 fans on site each day. Usually it's more like 200,000. But it brings up a point of, as much fun as everybody's having, there's always way more DUIs, way more arrests and things like that. But there's also accidents, people get hurt, that type of thing. So it's a good opportunity for us to talk about what happens when that happens on our watch or something that we're connected to. Because when you think about it, now that you're a public figure, if you're a professional golfer, you have a target on your back. People see dollar signs, so what you need to do is make sure that you're protecting yourself so that if something does happen and you're somehow connected to it, it may not even be your fault, but you just were there or you had some sort of connection to the accident or incident. They're going to go after you. They're not going to go after somebody else as just, Joe Schmo. They're going to see dollar signs as you as a professional athlete. So you need to take those steps to make sure that you protect your net worth. So one of the biggest things we see, and probably the first thing that comes to mind for, the everyday person that thinks about it is, if you get in a car accident or somebody slips and falls at your house, they're going to look to you and say, hey, you're the owner of the house, you're the owner of the car. It was your fault. I'm hurt. My back hurts. I need you to pay for my medical bills and all the work I'm going to be missing. And, oh, you're a professional golfer. I see your staff bag in the trunk. Cool. You must be worth millions. Like, my back hurts even more now. So we really want to make sure that we, first of all, have all of those like car insurance and homeowners insurance up to date and have all of our limits where they need to be. But on top of that, what we need is what's called an umbrella policy or a personal liability policy. And they're actually fairly cheap. And what you want to make sure is that value that you're insuring against liability is equal to your net worth, or as your net worth really gets high, equal to an amount that somebody's not going to be able to sue for over. I'm not going to say for hard numbers, but when we get up into the high millions, we're not going to need to insure a larger amount than that because somebody's not going to be able to say, hey, you owe me $100 million for my back hurting. But we do need to make sure that we're watching out for some of the things that you don't think about. When we're on the road and we're traveling, we typically, if we're not in a hotel, we're going to rent a house. Well, what happens if somebody comes to that house and they trip and fall, or you guys have a few people over and somebody gets hurt there? That's on you if your name is on the lease, even if it's just for the night or the month or the week. So what I really encourage you to do is if you're, especially when it's not on the road for tournaments, but let's say you and your buddies are going out to Vegas or Palm Springs or somewhere for vacation to go have a little bit of fun, don't put your name on the lease. Let one of your other buddies do it. You can pay for it still if that's the plan, but let them put their name on the lease. That way you have some separation there. Because again, what we don't want is if you don't have anything to do with something bad that happens, we don't want you to have any liability there. Unfortunately, we've seen that happen. And just because you want to pay for it, be nice for your buddies. You don't need to put your name on the lease because that immediately ties you to what could go wrong. The other thing is, I've seen this happen. Luckily, I didn't get sued, but dog bites. I have a dog. She's a lab. She's friendly to all the people. Everyone sees a lab, and they're super friendly dogs, and so they let their dogs run up. Well, she's a jerk, plain and simple. She does not like a lot of other dogs, and luckily, she hasn't bitten any of them. But at the same time, if she were to bite another dog or bite somebody else, they could absolutely sue me for that. And if I'm a professional golfer still, which I'm not anymore, thankfully, in that sense, they can jack up the price that they want to sue me for. So we want to make sure that like some of those extra things that we don't really think about are not necessarily that we're covering those, but we have that protection in place. So if something weird happens and we could be found liable, that we have some coverage there. So we're not all of a sudden having this catastrophic event ruin our net worth in the future. Because the other thing is, they can go, if the judgment against you is for more than you have, they can go after your future earnings. So that, think, some of our younger guys that are just turning pro or just getting started, maybe it's their first year on tour, but they're doing well and they have, a 5-year contract, something like that with an endorsement deal, they can go after those future earnings. So we want to make sure that we have that protection in place. Um, as a public figure, it's really hard because you're in the limelight a little bit more. As a golfer, maybe not as much as football and basketball and baseball, but like take a look at Johnny Manziel, for example. Obviously, he's done some things that we don't agree with, and he's gotten in trouble with the law, but he's also gotten sued numerous times for nothing at all that he had anything to do with. They're fraudulent claims, but he still has to deal with them, and he still has to pay for a lawyer, his agents, and their lawyers to fight those things. So we want to make sure that we're covering our bases, so that we don't have those things come up. Because one of the benefits of having one of these liability policies is the insurance company's now in this with you. And what that does is not only they're going to pay for however much coverage you have if the judgment goes against you, but guess what? They don't want to pay millions of dollars out, so they're gonna put a bunch of money into their lawyers to fight this on your behalf. So that's actually can be one of the bigger benefits, on top of obviously having that coverage, so that you don't have to pay out of pocket if this lawsuit goes wrong against you. Another example is we've had an athlete where he was in a parking lot. He was backing up at the same time as somebody else. They bumped bumpers. They both parked. Looked. There's a little scratch. For normal people, the worst they do is say, "Hey, like, somebody needs to pay for the scratch," and nobody was necessarily one fault or the other, but they could tell that he was a Major League Baseball player. And guess what? The next day, they couldn't get out of bed, supposedly. And all of a sudden, it turns into this huge lawsuit, trying to get millions of dollars from a 2-mile-an-hour fender bender. So, again, we typically, especially when we're on the road, we're coming straight from the golf course, we're wearing our golf clothes still, we have our logos on, we have our stuff in the car. Like, it's pretty easy to see that we are a professional golfer. So we want to make sure that we do everything we can to protect that supposed target that we have on ourselves, so that we don't expose our money and the hard-earned dollars that we've earned and saved to lawsuits that really have no merit. The other thing that we can do, and we've talked about before, is setting up an LLC for the business side of it. If something goes wrong on the golf course or in anything that has to do with you as a golfer, the business, if somebody sues that's the whole point of the LLC, is they can only sue that company, your company, not you, the person. And therefore, only assets held inside of that company can be used against or paid out against that lawsuit. So it brings up another important point. And I've had to talk to a lot of guys about this. They go through the first couple steps of getting an LLC set up, funding it, and in terms of putting all their accounts in the name of the LLC for their business purposes, but then they leave all their money in it. The whole point is to move most of the money out of the LLC. So we really want to make sure that we're following those guidelines, so that we are using the LLC for its purpose, which is to protect our personal assets from the business side, and keeping some major separation there. The other part of keeping that separation is we don't want to commingle assets, because then we could run into the issue of what they call piercing the veil, where they say basically you're commingling assets. You're paying for business stuff out of the personal account. You're paying for personal stuff out of the business account. Therefore, the LLC really is invalid. And then all of a sudden, we've gone to all the hard work of setting up the LLC, and we don't have the protection. So really important to follow those guidelines too. So The point of this, and what I want all of you to take away from this, is hopefully you have somebody in your corner that has talked to you about an umbrella policy and a liability policy. We all have car insurance. We probably have homeowners insurance, or if we're renting, a renter's insurance policy. What we want to make sure is, if we're doing our umbrella policy with that same company, you need to make sure that they will actually insure you as an athlete with an umbrella policy. I didn't know this when I got my umbrella policy and I was still playing. I was paying for an umbrella policy that was invalid. That company did not insure athletes for umbrella policies, but the agent that I was using didn't know that. So he wrote me an umbrella policy. I was paying for it. And if a judgment actually came against me, the company wouldn't have validated it. And I would have been liable, even though I was paying out of pocket. All they probably would have done is refunded my payments to them. So again, this comes back into working with somebody that specializes in athletes. You need to make sure that you know all this stuff and that your advisors know all this stuff, so that you're working with the right companies and you're working with the right insurance companies that will actually cover you as an athlete. So we want to make sure that, one, we're protecting ourselves with an umbrella policy and an LLC and keeping that separation. But then hopefully you've already had that in place, but we need to reevaluate probably every year, every couple years, in terms of how much of that insurance we have in place versus what is our net worth. And net worth, as a definition, I know we throw that word around a lot, is not just what we have in the bank. It's what we have as an asset that we can hold ourselves. So that is going to be your bank accounts. That's going to be any liquid investment accounts. But the equity in your home is an asset. Your cars are an asset. But also your human capital, or your future earnings, technically are part of your net worth. Now, we haven't realized them yet, but again, people can sue you for your future earnings if you don't have enough to cover what they sue you for. So that's why making sure that we have an accurate accounting for what your net worth is currently, and what those future earnings could be, is super important, so that we can make sure that we're insuring against that and covering it. Insurance is there for a reason. It's to cover for a risk that we can't afford. And this is the definition of a risk we can't afford. We can't afford these multi-million-dollar lawsuits because we're an athlete. Somebody's going to add a 0 or 2 at the end of how much they want from you. So at the end of the day, let's learn from some of the athletes that have had to go through these lawsuits. Let's cover our bases. It's pretty cheap. It's very easy to do. Work with an advisor that knows what they're doing, has worked with athletes, and know which companies athletes can be covered under, and be a pro. Treat this like it's your job. Treat it like it's a business, because it is. So until next time, stay humble, stay hungry, and always be a pro. The information in this podcast is educational and general in nature and does not take into consideration the listener's personal circumstances. Therefore, it is not intended to be a substitute for specific, individualized financial, legal, or tax advice. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a final decision.